Exactly 57 years ago, in July 1961, the Bratsk Reservoir began to be filled in the Irkutsk region. It became the world's second largest man-made reservoir and swallowed up a huge number of large and small villages. Before the flooding, there was a real panic among the people living on the banks of the Angara River. They moved their houses, valuables, and some even dug up the bodies of their relatives to rebury them in a new place. Alla Kuzminishna was among those in a hurry to move. She told this mystical story to my grandmother, her best friend. Alachka was only 16 years old at the time. Together with her father, for several weeks she had been transporting her belongings in a cart pulled by a tired mare to a village, which was not subject to flooding. The last to go to the new place of residence was their house. Her father had no sons. Alla was an only child. So along with her male neighbors, the girl helped dismantle, along with the logs, the house in which she was born and grew up. I remember there was howling in the village in the evenings. Women, girls were crying. Nobody wanted to leave their settled homes. And what was it like for the old folk who were left alone? Fortunately, the village was friendly. We helped all of us to move. For example, today we moved the Prokopievskys, tomorrow the Savlievs. Grandma Alla remembered many years later, after the village was deserted and all the houses, cattle, and things were taken away, the people began to think about those who would never get up themselves. My mother, like dozens of other villagers, was buried in the local cemetery, Alla Kuzminishna told me. She died a year before what happened. My father, a kind carpenter, made her a good house and a good fence. My mother was destined to go underwater, and even on her grave did not come to her. How come? Many residents of the village, which was destined to disappear under the raging waters of the Angara, must have thought in a similar way. That is why Alla was not very surprised when people with carts and shovels started going to the graveyard. They were digging out coffins with remains of their relatives, loading them onto carts and taking them to their new place of residence, where they buried the dearly departed anew. I timidly approached my father and offered to take mother with me, the old woman says with a sigh. But my father was a stern man. He only brushed me off. You should think about the living, Alla, and your mother doesn't care anymore. With horror, the young girl imagined that the waters of the Angara River would swallow up her mother's last resting place, that her remains would float in the river, and that she would have nowhere else to go for Parents' Day. The next day, tormented by doubts, Alla could not stand it and begged her neighbor Grishka to take the coffin with the body of the deceased to her new resting place. Grishka put up a fight. He did not want to go against Kuzmich's tough temper, but he liked the fragile Alla, and maybe he will fall in love with her in gratitude. Grishin had free time only in the evening. It was already dying out when the guy with Alla and 2 shovels came to the cemetery. To help, that it was not scary, the guys took the dog Tisha. Sivka, the stallion in the cart, was quietly scratching the ground next to them. Alla and Grigory crossed themselves and began their work. 2 of them turned out to be uneasy while digging a deep enough grave. Grisha quickly got tired and sat down to rest. It got absolutely dark by that time and I felt so frightened. Baba Alla still shudders with memories. The village is empty. All people have already moved away and there is nobody for kilometers around. Only me and Grishka in the middle of the ruined cemetery. Everywhere the graves are dug over. The crosses are lying around and Tishka, the wretch, howls as if he sees somebody. Sivka also began to behave anxiously. Always calm and gentle, horse beat the ground with his hoof, squinted his bloodshot eyes, and then jerked from his place together with the cart. Grigory, cursing, rushed after and, not seeing in the dark, fell right into the unearthed grave. Terrified girl ran to help her friend, but what she saw made her freeze in righteous horror. A cemetery as if covered with a mist, people were walking in it. They were walking in a tired, staggering gait, like a drunken man. Alla, numb with fear, began to recognize the dead countrymen in them. They did not see the girl. They just kept walking and talking quietly to one another. The frightening procession stopped only at dawn. With the first rays of the sun, the fog cleared and the last silhouettes of the dead disappeared. Alla Kuzminishna always grasped at this moment her heart and drank water in large gulps. Silently, I helped Grishka out of the grave, and just silently we left. We left mother there. There was no more strength. Alla Kuzmanishna kept silent about this story for many years. She couldn't endure it only in 2016, when the water on Bratsk Reservoir receded for almost 150 meters and an old cemetery opened on the sandy shore. I remember Grandma Alla crying very much watching the news on TV, and my mommy is somewhere also lying alone underwater, or her bones are floating somewhere. My mother had an aunt named Areta Yakovlevna, my grandmother's older sister. She was the kindest person, and in the pocket of her knitted vest she always had lemon caramels, which she always gave to all the kids she met. I called her Grandma Ira, and I loved to visit her. Grandma Ira lived alone in a big old house with 2 floors, and our family lived across the street, so we helped the old relative. I often went to her with errands from my mother, sometimes stayed overnight at Baba Ira's request. One day I asked my mother why Grandma Ira had no one, no husband, no children. And my mother told me such a story. Areta married early, as was the custom in the village. She got a good, hard-working and kind husband. They had 3 children, 2 twin sons and a little daughter 2 years later. They lived together and raised their children. Areta was 36 years old when her mother died, and then her stepfather fell ill after a serious illness. Areta had not abandoned her stepfather. For once, after the death of her own father, he had taken care of the family. Her stepfather had a difficult character, and his health had deteriorated. He was displeased with everything, cursing and shouting, sending curses at Areta and her family, but she trembled and fulfilled her filial duty to the end. When her stepfather died in the summer, Areta and her husband breathed a sigh of relief, though of course the event was bitter. The man was gone. That same year, in late autumn, Areta was walking from the cemetery, cleaning up the graves of her relatives before winter. She walks slowly, seems to have a little rest, and suddenly, right in front of her, a large black crow sat down on the path. It sat down and did not scare a man at all. Areta raised her hand. The raven reluctantly flew away and sat down again, tilted its black head and watched. So the raven guided her to the outskirts. Areta reached the well. She looks, and there is a post near the well. Who and when dug it up, she does not understand. It seems, when she went to the cemetery, there was no post here. The pillar is a lot taller than a person, a freshly chopped log, as if. When Areta came near, a raven sat on the top of the pillar, opened its black wings, and, looking straight at Areta, suddenly squeaked in a husky, cracking voice. Everyone will go away. No one will come. 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 Just then Areta fainted and fell on the frozen ground. Her neighbor Nikitovna, who came to the well for water, revived her and found Areta lying unconscious at the well. She saw that there was no pole at the well, and that there was no crow. Everything is as it was. In time all this flattened out in Areta's memory. They lived like everyone else. They were getting ready to marry one of their sons, and the groom was already looking at his daughter. The wedding was not fated to take place, because in the summer the war began. They dug a pole by the well and fixed a loudspeaker on it. And in 43, Areta understood what Raven was telling her. Everyone had gone. No one came back. Her husband, 2 sons, a beautiful daughter. Areta was left alone, living in a large house, keeping a few pictures of loved ones and 4 notices of death. My grandmother, my mother's own aunt, was a meek, calm, strong woman who raised not only her own 4 children, but also 4 orphans left by her neighbors. Grandmother, all her relatives called her mother, carried her nickname deservedly. Mother said that when she was little, Grandma sometimes gave her a piece of bread and clean water in a jug, and ordered her to take and give it to the German prisoners who were working to build houses. Then they came home later, but quite a few of them also died of disease and post-war hunger. And those who died were buried in a small cemetery away from the town, behind the common cemetery. It so happened that one day some distraught boys, whose fathers had not returned from the war, decided to desecrate this cemetery. It was understandable. My grandmother's little brother, 12 years old, went along with them. They dug out the graves, spread and desecrated the remains. In the evening, the whole street knew what they had done. When the grandmother heard about the involvement of her little one, she told all the younger brothers, including the desecrator, to take shovels and hoes and follow her. They buried the graves they had dug and brought the remains back out of the ground. The grandmother read a yasin over them and asked them not to take revenge and not to harm the living. That same evening, the eldest of the little vandals who had taken part in the desecration fell ill with a fever. The rest of the boys, including Grandma's youngest, fell ill. They died one by one, all except him. He was very ill, gaunt as a skeleton, but not dead. I was very young when my grandfather told this story one day when he was drunk. My grandmother, who was present, began to admonish us kittens never to insult the dead. How much time has passed. My grandmother is gone. I myself am in my gray tits, but I remember her words as I do now. Every bone has a right to rest. Do not anger the dead, otherwise you will anger Allah. If you see bones, bury them and say a prayer. Don't remember the prayer, just wish peace and rest to the dead. But even more strongly imprinted were the words of my grandfather, my grandmother's youngest. As I closed my eyes, they stood. Their breath reeked of the grave. Their eyes burned like the fires of Jahannam. If it had not been for my sister, they would have taken me too.